Hello, and welcome to another episode of the Heart Centered Therapist podcast. I'm Sindee Gozansky, your host, and I am so excited to welcome my guest today. It is really a privilege to introduce you to Christine McCarroll. Christine McCarroll is a functional nutritionist, board certified in holistic nutrition, and a certified brain health professional. She's also a woman with late diagnosed ADHD and mom to a daughter with ADHD. After helping her then 2-year-old daughter overcome a neurological speech disorder using nutritional therapy, she realized the assembly style, one size fits all, pill for every ill model of modern healthcare was better suited for factories than families. So she rebelled and has helped hundreds of women recover mood, energy, and mojo, slaying period problems and clearing up brain fog and ADHD symptoms along the way. Christine is also the creator and host of the top-ranked podcast, The Bitch Fix, Health and Hormones for the Modern Woman, where she interviews experts and shares her no BS views on all things women's health, as well as the upcoming podcast, ADHD Naturally, Smart Solutions for Holistic Women. Welcome, Christine. I'm so happy to have you here today.
Thank you, Cindy. I'm excited to be here.
Yes. I know so many of my listeners, both therapists and people listening in general, have either themselves experienced ADHD or have loved ones with ADHD. And especially for women, like this topic is so hot. Women are getting diagnosed with ADHD at twice the rate than just a couple of years ago. Like we're getting more later midlife diagnoses for women. And you yourself said you were diagnosed later in life. So maybe start with a little of your journey, please, and what's going on with this.
Yeah, sure. So my journey was kind of a side door into diagnosis. But I think like a lot of women, it kind of came to the surface through one of my children, right? So I had been having some or really witnessing some struggles that she was having in school. And I had reached out to someone at the school who had known her since she was a little kid. Um, and we had a conversation, and I realize now that they actually can't say things like ADHD at school because that's diagnostic. And so I got this code word, which is executive functioning challenges. And so I didn't know at the time that that was sort of code. So she hands me this sheet of, the challenges with executive functioning, and I was like, well, obviously, all of these boxes check, right? Like this is my kiddo 100%. So we left, left that conversation. My husband and I were talking about it, but it was also the end of the school year. There's just so much craziness that happens at the end of the school year. I literally folded up that piece of paper and put it in my purse. And we, were talking about it, but like we didn't really pursue much at that time. So, fast forwarding not that long, like month or two, I had been doing some testing on my own for a new company that does genetic assessment because I do genetic assessment as part of my practice. So I was testing
Mhm.
out this new company, and I got my report back. And by the way, I have to say this up front, genetic testing is not diagnostic for ADHD. So I have to be very clear there. um,
Right,
but my
right.
report said high likelihood or higher genetic susceptibility to ADHD. And it was this like complete lightning bolt moment for me. It was just like pure truth. Like this
Wow.
could not possibly not be true for me. And
Yes.
I immediately, I start looking up, what are symptoms like and how does this present? And I see the list and I'm like, oh my God, this is my daughter's list of executive functioning challenges that I had from, her school a couple months ago. So I get out the list, I look and I'm like, well, this is exactly true. And as I started learning, there's a strong genetic relationship. So if your kiddo has a diagnosis, there's a very strong likelihood that one or both of the parents does as well. So
Yes.
I just decided I needed to go all in on this and understanding it. There's also this part of ADHD that's hyper focus, and I for sure went into hyper focus mode. Like I was
Mhm.
like, you could not get me off of that topic. I had to
Right.
understand everything that there was to understand, and I also knew that I wanted to pursue a diagnosis for myself, not because I didn't have that gut level understanding that it was true, because I absolutely did, but because I knew I would need to get some support for my daughter and
Mhm.
knowing that she would need a diagnosis to actually get support in school and things like that, I also thought, wow, this is going to be a lot easier for her if she knows that we're going through this together. Like we are in this as a team. We're going through this together. Um, and so, that was kind of my entry point. But also, again, like I said, mine was really different in that way. But I think where it is the same is a lot of women are seeing getting a child diagnosed, and then you look at the symptoms and you go, wow, that is actually me too.
Yeah, yeah. Thank you for sharing that. I love how you said, then we can do it together as a team and kind of,
Mhm.
explore what that's going to look like for both of you. I imagine, Christine, like even as you're saying this, it was probably like not something that somebody had suggested might be a possibility for you, right? You're very articulate. I know you have your master's degree, you're smart, you're like you can focus really well on certain things that you're interested in. You're like put together. Like most people, that would not necessarily fit what we have a stereotype as, um, jittery ADHD, bouncing off the walls,
Mhm.
struggling in academics. Like that probably was not you at all.
Mhm. Yeah, I think I call it the smart girl ADHD tax, right? So there's this
Yes.
idea of the ADHD tax that people in ADHD circles talk about, where it's basically like we end up paying for a lot of things in our lives because we forget, right? Like we
Oh
end
my
up
God.
paying the extra fine for the library book because we forgot to turn the library book in. We meant to go return something to the store, but the return window passed and now we are stuck with this thing and we had to pay for it. So there's this idea that we just pay for a lot of things in life by having ADHD. And I think about this ADHD tax of a smart female, which
Mhm.
is that nobody believes her,
Yeah.
right? So, my sister has her PhD and she was really struggling going through her PhD program. And she saw out a psychotherapist to potentially get a diagnosis in grad school and basically was laughed out of the office and said, like, oh, you're in a PhD program. It's not possible for you to have ADHD, right?
Wow.
And so, there is this challenge where, maybe there's less belief about the struggles that someone has if we're doing okay in one area. So, a
Mhm.
lot of people with ADHD, like we were talking about a second ago, like that hyper focus can come into play, right? So if you're smart, you know how to do it. And then there's also the thing that a lot of women do that is different, which is masking, right? Like we will work so hard to put on every possible show that we are fine and we've got our act together. So no one's going to see how much harder it is to get things done or how much of a struggle it is to have that outward appearance of success because the intelligence is kind of overriding it. And there's also a lot of stigma around it still for women. Like,
Mhm.
I was reading a statistic this last week, and I don't remember the exact numbers, but percentage wise, it was like hundreds of times more likely that a woman was not going to disclose an ADHD diagnosis than a man, because there's still this feeling of the stigma attached to it. And so a lot of women are just hiding their symptoms and just like pretending and not telling other people how much of a struggle they're having. And so, especially women who are smart, have figured things out, have maybe gotten advanced degrees or have done really well professionally, there's like, oh, well, of course you don't have a problem, not really recognizing how actually hard it is to get to those achievements.
Yes. And that's why we're talking about this now. It's so important to combat these stigmas at every turn. And really, women have been hiding different things for so long, right? Or we struggle with that comparison, or we're told we have to be like superwoman, super mom, and there's another reason to just, not accept that or to not be believed. And, I love how you're talking about the um, ADHD self-tax, the smart woman ADHD self-tax. And
Mhm.
for my listeners, you have to check out Christine's Instagram because it's really great. She puts so many cool things on it. That's where I first learned about the smart woman ADHD self-tax. And it's Christine.McCarroll on Instagram. So definitely go check it out. And she has some great things that'll make you laugh, but it's also like so real, right? What you're saying, it's poignant for somebody who wants to be believed, who wants to have another way to have some more ease in their life, right? We have to have some kind of diagnosis so that we can make changes, so that we can take action.
Yeah. Absolutely. And, I think for a lot of women, getting a diagnosis is such a relief because it's just like it explains so much, right? So there is the whole other aspect of it's challenging maybe to share a diagnosis or to self-disclose. And there is, of course, still some like, hushing around topics like that. But for a lens to go back and see all of your struggles and say like, oh, there's a reason, right? Like I think there is almost this morality attached to some of the ways that women struggle who have ADHD, because it's counter to what we expect of women overall, right? The stereotypical woman does have it together, and she is in charge of the family calendar, and she remembers to send the thank you card after the birthday party, and she has everything organized at home. Like that is kind of your classic stereotypical woman. And even though there's a lot of fighting against like old norms, they kind of still do exist. And so if we're dealing with that as a woman, there's like some shame of, oh my God, like I'm not meeting the bill as what the perfect woman is. And so if you can kind of look back and go, oh, wow, like my brain just works differently. Like I'm not a bad person or a bad woman. I'm just like, I've had this struggle for my whole life. It can feel like such a relief to go, okay, like there's a reason and my brain works differently.
Yes, yes. And to let go of some of that shame and inadequacy, which it can be, it's so hard. I mean, it can just be so crushing at times. Um, and also people don't see like what it takes for that woman to do all of those things, to make that kind of picture perfect image. They don't
Hmm.
see like what goes on in the background. Um, so yeah, it's really interesting. I think, like you said, as more kids get diagnosed, then maybe, you know, the moms are starting to recognize some symptoms. I think something classic we hear about a lot is like for women, sometimes the hyperactivity portion is more internal with
Hmm.
like ruminating thoughts or this, kind of like energy inside or not being able to turn your brain off and go to sleep or maybe speak about some of the more common symptoms that women especially experience.
Hmm. Yeah, so you're totally right. A lot of times for women, that hyperactivity is internally driven.
Yeah.
And this is another reason it's a challenge for women and girls is what we would think of as like maybe more looking like your good girl, right? And like wanted characteristics like being quiet are what it's like not showing those symptoms, right? So the diagnostic criteria for ADHD, there's subcategories. And I think it's interesting that we even still keep it's like the H in there. Like, why is
Right.
hyperactive even even still in the acronym, right? But
Yeah.
there is the hyperactive type, which externally looks really like your classic little boy jumping off the walls. Then there's the inattentive type, which is like you're just not paying attention. You look like you're just daydreaming. And that
Hmm.
was actually where my daughter was struggling. She wasn't paying attention in class. She was drawing pictures, and her teacher was just furious because she's like drawing pictures instead of, listening to the
Hmm.
lecture. But
Yeah.
that was her inattentive type. And then there is a combined, certainly, where you can have more hyperactivity and more inattention. But a majority of women do fall more into that inattentive type. And that doesn't mean that there's not a bazillion things going on. It's just not the bouncing off the wall. It is all inside of the brain. The other thing that's really different and interesting for women is that there is an interaction between our female sex hormones and what's happening with that ability to focus, right? So, for a cycling woman, we have higher levels of estrogen at the beginning of our menstrual cycle, which potentiates dopamine, which dopamine challenges are one of the underlying factors with ADHD. So a woman with ADHD actually can feel a little bit better and more focused for the first couple of weeks of her cycle.
Mm-hmm.
And then when the estrogen drops in the second half of the menstrual cycle, we can feel a little bit less on top of things and a little bit more spacey, and we're dropping in dopamine as well. And then we're like, why all of a sudden can't I focus? Like, why am I struggling more? And so that inconsistency of symptoms is sometimes problematic in getting a diagnosis, but also in other people just believing you, because maybe sometimes you really are like not that symptomatic at the beginning of a cycle, and then
Hmm.
things really taper off. And then, where I've really been focusing a lot recently is in perimenopause and menopause, there's so many hormonal changes that are happening at that time as well. But one of the things that starts to kind of bring this to a boil is we have this up and down of estrogen at the beginning of the cycle. So where we used to be able to kind of reliably count on maybe even half of our cycle feeling more like alert and like having that acuity, the estrogen is very sporadic, right? So some days it's higher, some days it's lower, and it can leave our brains feeling like some days we're higher, some days we're lower. And you might be going, well, wow, I used to actually like, at least some of the time I felt like I was on it. And now it's like, I don't even know what to expect day to day. And so again, a lot of that struggle is internalized. Maybe sleep is being affected, maybe relationships are being affected, ability to perform at work. And we're, just kind of going, well, what's happening? And there just really hasn't been very much discussion about these changes in a perimenopausal woman's brain anyway. Like I feel like this conversation is maybe
Yeah.
2 to 3 years to the stage max right now.
Right.
And so that kind of double whammy of what happens with ADHD is just kind of like a completely invisible challenge.
Yes, and it's so important. And there are experts out there who are really researching this niche of women and hormones and ADHD, and especially the perimenopause and menopause. I've recently been enjoying listening to some of the podcast by Tracy Otsuka, the
Mhm.
ADHD for Smartass Women, and she has brought some of those guests on who are published authors and psychologists. It's really fascinating.
Yeah.
Yes, and so, the thing is, we're still programmed to believe, well, we should be able to do it all, or why aren't those great compensatory skills that I used to use to mask and cover and be really productive not working now that I'm postmenopausal? Why aren't they working
Mhm.
anymore? And all of a sudden, you know, instead you're diagnosed with more anxiety or more depression instead of looking at a brain or executive function issue.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. And that is a really common thing, especially because ADHD wasn't a diagnosis for a lot of times women in their 40s, right? So, like, I'm 46. When I was a kid in the 80s in school, it was still thought that ADHD was this little boy's issue. And so
Only for boys.
yep. So it wouldn't have even been talked about. And so, yeah, a lot of women didn't even, like, it doesn't even cross our minds. And so early on, maybe if there were struggles, yeah, some of those diagnoses might have been like anxiety or depression without any understanding that maybe there was something else potentially going on, and that either the anxiety or depression was just part of that, or that it was actually part of like maybe you're anxious because you're masking so hard on ADHD, right? It's not necessarily the root cause.
Right, right. And I encourage all of my listeners who are in the mental health world to think about that with some of your clients because often they can overlap so much. And if that um, hyperactivity is more internally driven, that could be experienced as anxiety when actually it's more closely related to ADHD. So it is hard to tease apart, but when you can start to look at the overall picture, and then as Christine, you're going to share, there are some other ways to like kind of amplify the diagnosis, right? Just like you said, you're um, a functional nutritionist. What is exactly your title, please?
Yeah, yeah. So
Functional,
the thing, yeah, so
yeah.
functional nutritionist, yeah,
Yeah.
that was my that's what I've been practicing for nearly a decade. And
Hmm.
then I went to study brain health specifically a couple of years ago. So certified brain health professional is the other half of that. Um, but honestly, a lot of the concepts are quite the same, which is we're just looking at what is the underlying physiology.
Right, physiology. And so
Hmm.
it's really broadening our perspective because we know therapy can work sometimes not in a vacuum. Sometimes we need medication, but again, there's that quote, right? Pills don't teach skills or, the pill for every ill, like you said.
Hmm.
So then what else? And I love so much what you say, Christine, about we have to look at brain health for mental health. Our brain is an organ, and we have to look at the health of our brain as well for mental health and wellness.
Hmm.
So through your research and experience, you've found some really interesting connections of ways to support somebody's brain health who has ADHD.
Hmm. Yeah, so I do. I think it's just totally fascinating that mental health is the only area of healthcare where we don't ever actually consider the health of the organ involved, right? Like we would never go to a cardiologist and like not talk about the health of the heart. Right? Like it's
Right.
very confusing to me that it is still like not an important part of the conversation. Um, and the way that I kind of think about it, like an analogy is, your brain is the hardware. And so thinking about the health of the brain is kind of like your hardware. And then when you do things like therapy and coaching, that's the software, right? So your thoughts
Mhm.
and your coping mechanisms and all of that. So if we're trying to load the latest software, you're getting your new iOS, but you have a computer from 1992 and the hardware doesn't really support that new operating system, we're really not going to
I
get the
love that
optimal result,
analogy.
right? Yeah.
Yes.
So when you have like really great hardware and then you put the latest software on there, well, now you have a much better operating system overall, right? And so,
Mhm.
um, like I think coping strategies, therapy, like ways that we can um, think more positively about our situation and have tools that help us, to live better lives is so important. And if you're feeling really bad all the time, it's actually harder to put those tools into practice. So if you're really, sleep deprived, and you are, your period's wonky and your brain foggy, like all of these other things, you're going to have a harder time putting some of those suggestions into practice, right?
Exactly.
So,
Exactly. And you have such a beautiful reel on your Instagram about that, like if we're not getting, what did you try? Did you try sleep? Did you try exercise? Did you call a friend, right? But oftentimes we can't do any of those.
yeah, and the more that we kind of look at like, well, how do we support ourselves as whole humans?
Hmm.
Obviously, we're going to get better results, right?
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
um, for for women in particular, we do go through these, drastic changes around perimenopause and menopause, where we're having hormonal shifts that are affecting how we feel. But even so, I spent the majority, to back up for just a second, I spent
Yeah.
the majority of my practice working on women's health and talking about hormones before I ever went down like fully just looking at the relationship of brain and hormones. And so many women are just thinking about their sex hormones, which are obviously incredibly important, but estrogen and progesterone, as like the drivers of the issue. We have other hormones in our bodies that actually direct estrogen and progesterone, right? So if blood sugar is dysregulated, it's actually your body will put a priority on regulating blood sugar before we're going to try to regulate our sex hormones, because that's more of an issue of survival.
Mm.
This is the same when we're thinking about brain health. So if we are not, so your brain is actually your largest consumer of glucose in the body. So if your blood sugar is super erratic and you have like super high and super low blood sugar all the time, we're also going to have irregularity in our brain function, because your brain is the one that is using a huge portion of that glucose. So if your blood sugar is all over the place, we're going to have a big challenge with our brain and also maybe with our period. The other
Mhm.
thing that happens in perimenopause is we may start to become insulin resistant, meaning like we start to have like underlying blood sugar issues just as a function of getting older, which sucks. And I'm sorry to just be the bearer of bad news. But our brains can also become insulin resistant, meaning they need this glucose and they're having a hard time getting it.
Yeah.
So starting with some like super foundational items, no one wants to hear that actually. Like they want to just like hear what's the sexy test or what's the sexy supplement or like what's the like thing that I'm
Right.
going to do. But like just starting with having regulated sleep and regulated blood sugar could make massive differences for like all women,
Yeah.
but especially women with ADHD.
Mm.
And we can very simply start to look at how do we affect our biochemistry. So there are other things. Women need to look at thyroid hormone in midlife. We need to be looking at other, sex hormones and things like that. But we can start with some foundational stuff that just gets missed.
Mhm.
And honestly, sadly, we're not even getting asked about this in like an annual care visit, right? Like
Exactly. Right.
not we're not even talking like on a regular like blood panel. No one's even looking at like your blood sugar, which is just crazy to
Right.
me. But
Right. Or they're just like, oh, your iron's not that low. Don't worry about it. I mean, that happened to
mhm,
me. And I'm still like, well, should I take a multivitamin with iron? Like, what should I do? Or every time that I feel tired, I'm like, I wonder if it's the iron thing. It wasn't like
mhm,
that low, but a little low. Do you know what I mean? Like, we are
mhm.
not always given the best advice.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So there's, unfortunately, there is very little education in medical school on nutrition. The stats a few years ago were less than 7 hours. And by that, I don't mean school hours. I mean actual literal hours listening to a lecture, learning about
Right.
nutrition, right?
Right.
Few, if any, hours. This was like, kind of trending recently on social media on menopause, or
Mm,
hormonal shifts in women, right? And so we look at this and we go, well, we're going to our trusted advisor, we're going into our doctor in a regular appointment, but they have
yeah.
learned nothing about nutrition and nothing about menopause or perimenopause. And a woman is presenting with these symptoms, like it's not their fault, they just never learned, right? It was just never part of their training. And so um, unfortunately, a lot of women have to just start like learning things on their own and self-advocating and asking for more things. But like to your point about iron, like most doctors aren't even doing a full iron panel, which is iron, ferritin, and it's TIBC, which is iron binding capacity, which tells us a lot more about iron status than
Mhm.
just iron, right?
Right.
So
Yeah.
when we kind of just get a real fast like check and a real fast little appointment, and then they're like, everything looks normal, and they send us on our way, and we're like, well, what do I do now? Like, why do I still feel like crap? You told me everything was normal. That's a
Yeah,
problem.
exactly. Oh, Christine, this is so inspiring for us. And I love that you're so smart and educated about this because we don't hear it enough, right? You're out there, breaking the mold on how we can have more wellness in our lives, and especially for women. Um, because often also we're like afraid to ask about things. We don't want to be
Mhm.
seen as, oh, right, it's you again, you're calling again, or whatever. So, there's just stigma across the board. And what I love is you're looking at a way to expand our health, right? There's therapy, coaching, coping skills. Medication for ADHD can work. Some people can't always take it. So there's nothing wrong with that. And then you're adding another aspect of boosting health and boosting like that quality of life for somebody.
Yeah. So there's this idea of there's lifespan and there's health span, right? And
Mm,
so like a lot of times literature is just directed at lifespan, right? And that's important, but health span, like feeling good and feeling vibrant and all of that as you get older, to me is like that's where the money's at, right? And by that I mean like that's where it's like the juicy stuff for us.
we want that.
I We want that. Yeah. I mean, I'm at an age now, I'm certainly the sandwich generation. I have teenagers coming up in my house. I have aging parents. We've gone through a couple of health crises in the last couple of years, like really major health crises with my
Oh,
parents.
I'm
And
sorry.
yeah, I mean,
That's
it's a
hard.
challenge, but I will say,
Yeah.
like, there is almost nothing that can, light a fire under me besides something happening to my family. Like,
Yeah.
stuff with my daughter was what kind of changed my life trajectory. But seeing my parents, um, you know, they're here, but their quality of life is not where I want my quality of life to be, when I'm their age. And so, I'm really looking at, well, that's not what I want to do. So what do I do differently now? Like, and I am, if I start to slip up or I start to, like, I'm a human, right? But I just think about, well, where do I want to actually be, when I'm in my 70s, not just alive, but like feeling great. And
Feeling
that's really
great. Yeah.
motivating to me.
And you give us so much hope about that, which I think is wonderful. And we also want to have agency, right? Like this is the thing, so much of our care has, especially as women, has been medicalized, even, from, the birth process, all of that. And here you're sharing through functional nutrition and medicine that there are other ways that we can take action. Um, and that's so important for us that when we can have like an active role in our health and give
Mhm.
ourselves hope and our families hope, right? Which is what
Mhm.
you've done with your daughter and with yourself, and you're modeling that. So maybe share with us some of the things that, most listeners don't know about ADHD and, um, biochemicals and the different supplements and nutrition that we should be concerned about.
Mhm. So, I think it partly depends on, who you're talking to, what they know and don't know about ADHD. One thing I will say that's interesting before I get into some of the things we can do to support ourselves and others,
Mhm.
is I've had some great therapists, but I never had a therapist who actually could pinpoint that some of the struggles was having were representative of ADHD, right? Um, and so even having like a willingness to say, like maybe if someone comes in and they're like, I kind of like have been seeing some stuff around and these symptoms sound like maybe they could be me, like a willingness to have a conversation, right? And to say like, I hear you, and not to brush off symptoms because someone is, for example, smart or doing well in school or doing well in a career or something like that, right? I
Yeah.
remember I had a real struggle. Certainly, there was hormonal changes happening when my youngest daughter was, maybe like between 1 and 2, and I was trying to make myself all these lists. And one of the things that I literally had to put on my list was brush my teeth. Like, if
Oh,
brush my teeth was not on my list, like might not get done. um, and part of it, and I remember having this whole conversation with my therapist about like having to put brushing my teeth on the list. And part of it wasn't just like I needed to be reminded, it was that in my brain, that was equally important as just about everything else. And so prioritizing like something like, picking my child up from daycare against brushing my teeth, that sounds really dumb, but like it's just this thing where everything seems the same, which is one reason why people with ADHD get really overwhelmed. Is it seems like there's
okay.
so many things that require action and they all seem about the same importance wise. And so we might struggle with like, well, what's the most important thing to do? And she was actually a wonderful therapist who had helped me with a lot of things, but like she had no understanding that that might be something related to
Right.
ADHD, right?
That
And
is
so,
fascinating. Yes.
yeah.
I mean, I don't think it's common knowledge. That's just
Mm-mm.
it. Because we think ADHD, it's that typical list or that the questionnaire. It's like, do you forget things? Do you finish other people's sentences? Right? Sometimes those are not it. I
Yeah.
didn't even know the concept of time blindness until I started learning more about ADHD.
Yeah, totally. And
And
it's not in the
every time
diagnostic criteria manual. So,
it's not, but every time like I need to go somewhere, my husband always tells me, 10 minutes. He tells me 10 minutes sooner so that I'll be ready on
to
time.
be right, right. Yeah, totally.
Yeah.
Well, I will say, like, for someone who's like just curious about learning in general, I think of
Mhm.
her as like the mother of ADHD in women as Sari Solden. She was a guest on my podcast
I
like a year and
know,
a
I
half
can't wait
ago.
to
She's
listen to that one.
Yeah, she's fantastic. I love her, but like her book was one of the very first things I read right up
Mhm.
front. And I believe it is just called ADHD in Women, something very
Mhm.
similar to that anyway. And if you look her up, you can find her book. But really just understanding that it doesn't look the same for women.
Right.
And that there's also oftentimes been this long-term struggle. And so if you kind of look back and you go, oh, wow, like there's been this lifetime of issues. And so, kind of everything that falls under that executive function stuff, like being organized, as you mentioned, time blindness, right? Like not knowing where we are in, or thinking really like, this isn't going to take me that long when actually it's going to take you an hour, right? I can do this in 10 minutes and then
Yeah.
obviously not. Um, Struggling with prioritization, having a challenge with getting motivated to start something. So like in school, like I actually did really well. I was always like honor society and things like that. Graduated with honors, all this stuff. But I had to, like, I was procrastinating not because like it wasn't like I don't want to. It was literally because I was relying on my stress hormones to motivate me to begin the project. Like
Mm,
just that
interesting.
task
Right.
initiation can be such a challenge. Um, and there isn't that like same dopamine hit that other people, neurotypical people have around like getting started or planning things out. Like we really need that like kick in the butt to be able to get things moving, right? So
Mhm.
I would be spending time, I'd be, a few nights before finals, I was pulling all-nighters. And it wasn't just like, the average college student all-nighters. Like it was really like that was the only way that I could get things done.
Yes.
And so, looking back, you can say, oh, well, there's all of these patterns there. But some of those issues that might be more hidden, again, like maybe someone looks fine on the outside, but some of those more hidden things are true a lot for women.
Yes, and Christine, to your point about often having therapists who don't see, the possibility of ADHD as a diagnosis, I think sometimes it's because, we, the clients, and especially women, will feel embarrassed to even say something
Yeah.
about what these little things are. I'm kind of
Mhm.
exploring it for myself right now, like, no shame, no story, but I'm, it wasn't until I actually really opened up and told my therapist, yeah, well, like I might decide to try to clean the shower, even though I know that I have to like be on a session in 20 minutes. Right. But if I'm showering, why not? Right. I know that's like a
Right.
silly example,
No, it's a
but
really true example.
it's true, right?
Yeah.
And
Hmm.
and all of a sudden, a whole new avenue can open up if somebody's willing to like think a little bit outside the box and has that experience and expertise. And how do we get it? We get it by listening to experts like you, Christine, sharing this. You're creating a brand new podcast, ADHD Naturally. Like that's an amazing gift to, to women, to the community, to parents. And so I really encourage therapists to like look beyond and expand your reach in terms of your learning.
Hmm.
It's so important.
Yeah. And there are actually, I mean, there's a lot of great resources on ADHD for women. Like I said, I think Sarah Solden's work is groundbreaking. And then there are, fantastic just general brain health conversations happening now as well, which just makes me so happy. I think what I'm looking to do is really like bridge these conversations because I think they're maybe somewhat happening separately and they're both important. But
Yes.
thinking about like how do we support brain health. And there's things that are nutritionally related, there's things that are lifestyle related, there are nutraceuticals, which is basically like herbs and minerals and supplements and things like that that can be important to look at. But we actually have a lot of tools available. And also there has been, more of a flurry of activity and research recently so that we can point to some things that actually have been researched and research supports helping our brains just do better and feel better, right? So um
Right. And even
yeah.
without ADHD, I mean, again, so many
Hmm.
of the strategies, the organizational strategies, the apps we use, that can help everybody. And the
Hmm.
same thing with, holistic health, right? A lot of these um, ways that we can improve our brain health is going to help whether or not you have ADHD.
Yeah, I totally agree. And that's why like a lot of the things are super foundational. And you can get into some nuance or once you have a diagnosis and say, okay, well maybe this is like these particular things that would have an impact for anybody. The impact will be amplified if you have ADHD and we're trying to manage the symptoms. But yes, absolutely, these are things that are important for everyone, and for every woman and every woman going through perimenopause. I just feel like I'm seeing more and more stories of women who are even wondering like, oh gosh, did I just like develop ADHD because I'm having all these brain challenges in perimenopause? And we do have brain changes that happen regardless of whether or not you have ADHD. It's just that can be really amplified if we have underlying brain issues, to
Right.
consider. But
Right.
women's hormone fluctuations are going to affect us no matter what. And so
Hmm.
just recognizing that and like, okay, well, how do I support my whole health? Then, we're going to have even better effects with anything that we're
Yes.
trying.
Yes. Yeah, that's great. I do love when you talk about the nuances of different things that can be helpful for our brain health. Maybe you could
Mhm.
give our listeners a taste of some of that. I've heard you talk about
Yeah.
the DHEA and
Hmm.
um,
So, a few things that are important. I think I've said it like 3 times already today, but just because it's so important, is sleep. Unfortunately, it's one of those things that also perimenopause tends to mess up sleep, and also genetically, people who are neurodivergent tend to also have genes that are disruptive to sleep. Like we have something, I love the name of it. It's actually called the clock gene, and it regulates our biorhythms and like when we want to fall asleep, and so there can be disruption in that gene a lot of times if in folks who are neurodivergent. And so sleep can be a challenge, but it's also a huge priority. Like my husband teases me about how much like I won't go over to the neighbor's house and like how like hang out on a Friday night if I think my sleep is going to be messed up,
oh
right? I'm
my
like, nope,
gosh.
my sleep is like my number one priority.
Well,
um
that's why you look so vibrant. That's it.
I cannot function if I haven't had solid sleep. And I have my own little special things I have to do to help myself sleep because it did get worse in
Hmm.
perimenopause, right? So
Yeah.
I super protect that.
Yeah.
Um, I also am really like, I prioritize movement. Again, helpful for
Mhm.
everybody. But for someone who struggles with attention, we get this kind of like afterglow of exercise that can last for about 3 hours. So if you are struggling with, with paying attention or getting started on something, and that's the time you want to time your movement, like it doesn't have to be crazy. You can just go for a brisk walk.
Mhm.
But if you are, if you're moving, you actually get that afterglow of focus. And so timing that can be really beneficial.
Yes,
I
I
talked about
love that.
keeping your, yeah.
Yeah,
um,
I have to tell you, Christine, I just had a guest on, Dr. Adel Corker, and um, he is doing a conference called Motion Impacts Emotions. And he's
ooh,
bringing
I love
in all
it.
kinds of um, scientists and people in the health and mental health arena to talk about the importance of motion and exercise on health.
Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely. And if you just think about, like the metabolism of the cells in our brain, which is like a whole other topic, but if we get blood flow to those cells, they're going to work a lot better, right? Which the best way to do that is moving. And there's lots of research on movement and like things like anxiety, depression,
Mhm.
like equal results to medication. So not as much necessarily in ADHD, but again, like these are it's not going to hurt you to go take a
Right.
walk. Um, Keeping your blood sugar stable. I think one of the things that a lot of women, who come to me and they're like, the thing I hear is, but I eat healthy, and healthy can mean a lot of different things to a lot of different people. But even healthy foods, if we're eating mostly carbohydrates and not enough protein, we're not going to be getting actually like the building blocks that our brain needs to make neurotransmitters, right? So, I think about this as like they're like little Legos, and so the when protein breaks down into its constituent Legos, it becomes amino acids. Amino acids are the building blocks for neurotransmitters. So if you're simply not eating enough protein, you won't have enough little Legos to go make your neurotransmitters.
Mm.
It's a very like straightforward requirement. And so a lot of people just eating a lot more protein will start to feel better. And that's a huge shift, but relatively, I'll say simple, not easy. A lot of people struggle to get enough, but straightforward, right? And so something
Yeah.
like starting with 30 grams of protein at breakfast will really set the tone for the rest of the day and how you feel.
Yeah.
Um,
And
and
you do
then
that
specifically,
with your daughter too.
yes. Oh my gosh. I mean, my children think I'm like the protein Nazi. I'm like, do you have protein in that snack? Like making sure
Yeah.
everything's happening, but like I will not let them leave the house without a protein breakfast. So
Hmm.
um, it's
Right.
critically important.
And probably most of us don't do that, you know? So even if you just, as you're listening to this, make one change this
Mhm.
week, make another change next week.
Yeah, and it can totally snowball. And you just
Hmm.
think about the little steps over time, that's classic change, but for sure it adds up. So, so I would say those are like the foundational things that are super helpful for everybody. And then it is helpful to look at things like micronutrient status. So there's some research out there that shows sometimes zinc having equal effect to stimulant medication for management of ADHD. My personal belief is that probably those folks were deficient in zinc to begin with, but you don't know if you don't test it, right? Same thing, like we require iron to create dopamine in the brain. So you were talking about like, well, I'm kind
Yeah.
of borderline, right? It's important to actually test and make sure that your iron is sufficient, because otherwise you don't have those building
Mhm.
blocks that you need to be making your neurotransmitters. I've been very informally tracking. This is certainly not going to be peer-reviewed literature at any point. But I told you I do look at genetics with my
Yes.
clients. And so what I've seen across the board is every person I have who has a genetic predisposition to ADHD, and by the way, there's this interplay of genetics and environment. It's not necessarily
Right.
just one thing, but 100% of people had either intolerance or like likely intolerance or likely immune challenges with gluten, right? A huge majority had problems with lactose. A huge majority
Yeah.
had problems with zinc transport, right? So even without having done something like looking at your genetics, it's super easy to try gluten-free, dairy-free for 30 days. Just like see what happens, see if your brain feels better. Um, you know, get your zinc levels tested, get your iron levels tested. Like they're very straightforward things. It's just that no one thinks to do them.
Right. Right. Yeah. Gosh, I wish everybody could have somebody like you on their team.
I get to as many people as I can.
Yeah. But again, even just saying that, right? We know there are genetic links to celiac. There are genetic links to, all of these other immunocompromised or immunosuppressed conditions. And so that's
Mhm.
that's really fascinating. Yeah. So
Yeah.
zinc is one, maybe looking at um, gluten and dairy,
Yeah, gluten and dairy,
iron.
iron testing. I will say, I actually would recommend someone just taking out gluten and dairy, not necessarily even going for lab testing, because a conventional doctor who's not really well versed in anything functional is probably just going to do a standard celiac test, which actually is not that
Right.
useful. Without someone with full-blown celiac, which is not everybody who has issues with gluten. And same thing with dairy. We can have an immune response. We can have a digestive response. It's not necessarily the same thing. It's not necessarily easily connected, but it's really easily connected if you do a little diary with yourself and you
Mhm.
say, I've taken it out for this long and how do I feel? Or how is my sleep? Or something like that, right? So like that classic elimination diet actually can be quite useful. Um, so, there was some research that came out at the end of last year, I believe in November, looking at autism spectrum and dietary changes. And of course, there's a different neurodivergent profile, but there quite often is this overlap with ADHD and autism. Um, and massive, massive results from dietary changes. And they actually tested 13 different diets with, without failure. Every single diet they tried did have an impact as long as the person was consistent. There was a significant impact. And so it was really less about a particular diet being the one, but really about like figuring out like which strategy is going to work for the person. But they had better outcomes than medication. They had fewer side effects. And the number one, like most impacted symptom was attention. Like if you look at the
Wow.
bar graph, attention was the one that was most predominantly affected. So we absolutely can make dietary changes that are going to help us feel better and more focused.
That's fascinating. And even just as you're saying that, right? Like that gives so much hope that there are
Mhm.
other ways to look at this and um just it's really inspiring.
Yeah. Well,
Yeah.
lots of like up to 30% of people can't take medication. So,
Mhm.
if we're leaving a bunch of people out in the cold, like even if we were doing these things in tandem, they're going to work better, right? But
Right.
if people can't take it, there's a lot of things we can do to support the health of the brain and feel better.
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. And, again, just even this is bucking stereotypes, right? Like you are so up on the research, you're so articulate about saying all of this, and yet you still have ADHD. Nobody would really suspect that, but you had to come to it in your own way. And I think that's what we really want people to realize that it can look so different, especially for women who are experiencing hormonal changes at different phases in their lives. And so don't give up. Keep looking and talking to other experts who are interested in especially holistic health.
Yeah, absolutely. And yeah, I think that's maybe where some of the like people are they women especially feel the stigma of like I can't say anything because it's like, oh well, no one's going to believe me. And so believing yourself first is kind of the first step, and then asking for support, finding someone who will listen or help, or even if you have to self-advocate, like I kind of got into this whole thing because I was advocating for my kid, and a lot of times people do find it easier to advocate for a child than to advocate for themselves. But like regardless of how you come into that, saying, okay, like there's things that I need and I'm willing to keep going until I get what I need. And if this person is going to shut the door on me, well, I'm going to have a conversation with someone else who will listen more. Um, just from personal experience from supporting a lot of women over a long period of time, I see that gynecologists are actually often quite more supportive in listening to women who have health concerns than a primary care person. So maybe if you've talked to your primary care person and they're not really helping you, maybe you go to your gynecologist who might be, even if they're not well versed in what you're talking about, might be more willing to listen and help you get, maybe to the bottom of some stuff, or willing to order some labs for you, or just take you more seriously.
Yeah, that's beautiful, beautiful advice. So Christine, we could keep talking for a whole other hour, but
Mhm.
for now, I'd love for you to share with everyone like where they can find out more about you, what you do, what you offer, because this has just been such an exciting conversation.
Yeah. So you mentioned earlier, I'm on Instagram. I have been true ADHD fashion, a little sporadic on that, but I'm trying to become more consistent in my own version. So it's just my name, Christine.McCarroll, on Instagram. The podcast will be relaunching. So I'm just actually rebranding the Bitch Fix,
Oh,
which is the old podcast. I'm rebranding it, and that's going to be happening in the next few weeks. So even if you just went out and subscribed to the Bitch Fix, you would get all of the updates that come along when I rebrand and start that. And then my website is also just my name. It's christinemccarroll.com. And I do have a private podcast that kind of just goes into, it's a short 4 episode podcast. It just goes into some of the things that we talked about in a little bit more detail, and also talks about things like, hey, here's some labs that you might want to ask your doctor for, those sorts of things. So it's on my website, christinemccarroll.com/private pod, and you can go get
oh,
access
cool.
to that. Yeah.
Wow, that's amazing. And do you like work one-on-one or in a group setting with clients?
Yeah, so I have historically only done one-on-one work or primarily done one-on-one work. I am actually looking to start a membership model in the next, like in the fall, because besides wanting to get like support to more women, I do feel like when we are in community with other people who understand what we're going through, it's just so powerful. And, that's one of the things that I wish I had had like way back in my early journey is just people who understood what I was going through. And so um, you know, having other women who understand, I think is so helpful. So that doesn't have any URLs or anything yet because it hasn't launched, but I will be sharing information as I progress
Yes.
into that.
Yeah, that's great. Well, make sure you follow Christine on Instagram so you can get all of that information. It's so important. I'm a firm believer in community. That's why I have the Heart-Centered Therapist community on Facebook for, therapists and social workers who just want to have community. And we need more of that because
Mhm.
this is hard, like doing the work that we do so alone.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. And absolutely for therapists, that's great that you have that community. I do think like, gosh, it must be like just hearing people's challenges all day and you feel like you have to own all of that and having other people who can support you. That's an amazing, amazing service that you have.
Yeah, yeah. I think, also so there are a lot of therapists who are women, so many, and we long for that kind of relational connection that
Yeah. Yep.
we don't always get. And just like you said, also through, ADHD journeys, through hormonal journeys where, tag, you're it. We're all gonna go through it.
Yep, absolutely. And our brains as women are primed for community. So
Ah,
yeah.
that's it. Our brains are
Mhm.
primed for community. It's so beautiful.
Yeah.
Christina, I'm so grateful for you spending the time and your expertise with us. And I really acknowledge all you're doing. I'm a huge fan, and I know you're going to get some more fans out of this. So just want to thank you again for being here and sharing with us all about ADHD and midlife women and ways we can find support.
Yeah. Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you.